Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg. And in the video today, I want to talk about what we should keep in mind when it comes to technology from a Christian perspective. And this is going to be kind of a broader discussion. I've seen a lot more talk recently about the implications of AI and things like that. That's artificial intelligence for anyone who doesn't know. There's some controversies with that people have been talking about. So this video isn't necessarily to talk about one specific thing like that. It's kind of more generally. I am going to be putting kind of an emphasis on things like the internet and TV, so that could include things like social media, what we search for online, movies, TV shows, things like that. And I think that this is important because technology has become more and more a part of society and our daily lives, and we can use it for good or bad purposes. And I feel like there are people that go to extremes with this. There are some people that don't use much wisdom when it comes to technology at all and maybe over rely on it and maybe to an extent even idolize it. And then there are some other people that will kind of have this pessimistic attitude of like, internet and TV are just 100% the devil and we have to completely avoid them. And I'll talk about this more as I go further in the video, but there are some people that they kind of like treat it like, practically they kind of have this attitude like the internet and TV are the devil. If we could just get rid of them, all the problems would be solved. And I think that ultimately we kind of have to look in the mirror of, where's our mindset at as well, and not just completely blame it on the technology, because there were people that did evil things throughout human history far before TV and internet existed. So it's important to keep that in mind. And so, like I said, technology has become integrated more and more into our daily lives and society. There's social media that a lot of people have and interact. People are able to talk to each other from across the world when that in ways that they used to not be able to. Online shopping is an option now, and you can have stuff delivered to your house. All these other kinds of things, and so I'll kind of be touching on those, and also kind of just general luxuries and conveniences we have that we used to not in human history. And so the first big point I want to make with this is that there are certainly negative applications of technology and things we need to use discernment with, but we don't need to be overly cynical where we just write off everything as being completely horrible just because it's new or people can mishandle it. And so, like, a positive use of technology is we can use it as a witnessing tool. Things like the internet and social media can allow us to connect and speak with people we never would have met otherwise. And that can be very beneficial when it comes to witnessing. I can tell you just for me, with having this online channel that I have, I've got to talk to people from places like India and China that I can almost guarantee you I never would have met these people without things like the internet in a strictly earthly sense. I know that God can work those kinds of things out, but I think that that's kind of a positive example of how we can use the internet with a positive mindset and positive intentions. And one thing that's kind of an interesting historical example of how certain things are possible now that used to not be able to is the speed of information. Nowadays, we're able to communicate with people just about instantly in a lot of different ways. You can call somebody who's very far away from you, or video chat, in real time, and get information to them like that. Um, but if you look back in history, there were times where people had to wait, weeks or even sometimes longer than that to get information. And the War of 1812 between the United States and the British officially ended in December of 1814, but the Battle of New Orleans broke out in January of 1815. And it was because the soldiers on both sides in that battle didn't know that the war was over yet. The news hadn't reached them yet. And so something like that probably wouldn't happen today. And so, again, there are benefits to technology. And technology can also help us be more time efficient if we use it well. And it's possible to waste time on technology as well. So it's important to know that. And that's kind of one of those examples of how we need to use discernment with it, and how it can have positive or negative outcomes depending on how you use it specifically. Like I said, we can use it in good ways like ministry tools, or to learn information faster, or to get important news to people more quickly. Or we can waste, an entire day doing trivial things that really don't add value to our life. And I will tell you, I've been guilty of that. But it's just one of those things where it's an opportunity to practice discernment, and to really think about what are we using our time for, our time and resources. And so a verse I wanted to read with this, and honestly, it was a little tricky to find some verses that applied to this specifically, because, of course, the Bible doesn't mention computers, the internet, TV, and phones, and things like that specifically, because those things didn't exist back then. But there are certain mindsets the Bible tells us to have that I think fit these questions of technology really well. And so a verse I wanted to read with this is 1 Timothy 6, verse 10. And it says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." And so I've talked about this several times on the channel, about the example of money, of how, and this verse says right here, it talks about the love of money and how that can lead to evil. And, there's an emphasis that needs to be made on where it says the love of money, because this verse doesn't say, money itself is the devil, burn it all. But it says how your mindset is toward it, how you're using it, things like that. That is where there can be a problem. And we see examples of that in the Bible. We see people that had more of a godly mindset toward money, and people who had a more evil and selfish mentality towards money. And the consequences of those came out. And so, again, that's like with the internet and TV and things like that, is your TV and the internet aren't flesh and blood people. They don't have a soul. Your TV isn't going to have to stand before God on Judgment Day. You will. And the people who created content that goes on the TV. But the TV and internet and things like that, and these other technologies, they are mediums. They are tools. They're not actual people. And I think that is important to remember when it comes to this. Of how I talked about, there are people that will talk about how like internet and the TV are the devil, and we just got to get rid of them, and that'll solve the problem. I think something that's important to think about is certainly we can use the internet and TV and other technologies for evil things. We absolutely can. I have heard things that I wasn't looking for, but people that would say things, that were so unbiblical and just so abhorrent, you know, against God and different things like that, that, just turned my stomach. And I'm like, I don't want to see that or hear that ever again. So these things can be used with an evil heart and an evil mindset, and those can have negative consequences. But something that's important to remember is if, for example, you're struggling with, you know, looking at things on the internet you shouldn't look at, or with the TV as well, or to use it in malicious ways like to attack people or start drama, maybe you do need to take a step back from it, especially if it's really bad. Um, and again, certainly we need to use discernment with those things. But if we have the mindset of, okay, well, the internet is evil, I'm just going to get rid of my internet. Well, if you have a real struggle, if all you do is get rid of the internet but you don't work on the condition of your heart, you're just going to find something else to use for some kind of evil purpose. So again, if you're looking at stuff on the internet or on TV that, is ungodly, and you just throw your TV in the dumpster and quit paying your internet bill, if you don't work on where's your heart at, you're just going to start buying books with ungodly stuff in it. Or, if you're using, social media to start drama and all that kind of stuff, and you delete your social media, but you also don't work on your heart, you're just going to find some other way to spread the drama. So I think it's important for us to, again, certainly use discernment with how we're using these things, but we need to also remember what the root of it is. If you have something where, maybe you fall and you hit your chest really hard and you have severe pain, and, say something like you've pierced your lung, and, you got that severe chest pain and you're coughing and, different things like that, and those are symptoms of your lung being pierced. The way to treat that isn't just to take some cough syrup for the coughing and a pain pill to get rid of the chest pain. You got to get to the root of that problem and fix that pierced lung. And I think there are people, and we can all be subject to this, especially if we haven't invited God into our lives to guide our lives. There are a lot of people that they want to treat symptoms of these things. And, they might even realize something doesn't feel right in my life. Maybe I'm looking at things I shouldn't, or, maybe, I've become too dependent on this or that, or, and, we might feel these things, but a lot of times we get hung up on trying to just treat symptoms when we really need to get at the heart of the problem. And I think that, it's so powerful when we read in God's Word and it talks about sanctification and justification and how we have the perfect Spirit of God inside of us to guide us and, to give us that perfect guidance and to comfort us. I think that that's really powerful to think about that, of that transformation. And the Bible talks about God making us a new creature and everything. And I think that that's powerful because we see all those things pertain to an internal transformation. And again, we'll fall short in this lifetime for sure. But I think that that's important to see, what the Bible hits home with this. We see over and over, the Bible talks about to love God with all your heart. And Jesus talking about where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. And we see an emphasis on what's the condition of the heart, and God giving, that internal transformation, and that's going to shine outward and make some of those external changes. And so I think that that's ultimately what we need to do. We need to think about that, of God's work inside of us and letting that shine out and, you know, determine how we approach these more external things. So I think that's the mindset that we need to have. And, maybe, you know, it's the case for you that, maybe you do need to take a step back from some of these things of, I need to unplug from the internet a little bit. Maybe you've become too hooked on checking social media every 5 minutes, or looking at things you shouldn't, or you get roped into the drama. Maybe you do feel it's necessary of, God's made this internal change in me, and I feel like, what the flesh man wants to do with these things doesn't go along with that internal change. By all means, if you really feel that God wants you to step back from these things, absolutely do that. But, there can be other people too that they approach something like the internet, and while using discernment, of course, and what they take in, say, this internal change God has put into me, I want to let that light shine out, including through this means of the internet, to tell people about Him by posting about my testimony, maybe recording a video telling people about what God has done for me, about sharing my daily Bible verse, or, different things like that. And so I think it's good to have that perspective. And I think another example is like, think of something like lumber. You know, lumber, boards of wood, and other things you might use to build as well, like concrete and things like that. Those aren't inherently, good or bad. You can use them to build good or bad things. You can use those things to build a church, and use that church as a place to really want to worship and serve God. Or you can use it to build an ungodly institution, and I'm sure we can think of a lot of examples of places that would fit that. And so that is ultimately, I think, the emphasis with it of, that's really kind of the heart of the issue of what are you using these things for. And and so that's kind of that aspect of it. But I also kind of want to touch on, we don't want to be that kind of person that, while we shouldn't be the kind of person that's just totally pessimistic and avoids the question of, where's the heart at. We shouldn't be also the kind of person that maybe we have too much of a forgiving view of, technology and how our world uses it in today's world, and just blindly trusting everything we see, or wasting, too much of our lives with, with things that we shouldn't. And, I think that one con of being over reliant on technology is sometimes it can make us lazy. And the Bible talks about patience as a fruit of the Spirit, and we shouldn't let dependencies on earthly things cause that to atrophy. And I've kind of seen it in my own life. When I was a little kid, things like Netflix and all that, I mean, they really weren't around. And so, movie stores were still kind of a thing when I was growing up. And I remember there was a movie store I really liked that was about 45 minutes from my house, and my mom would drive me there, let me look around. I'd get one movie, and we'd drive 45 minutes back. So that's at least an hour and a half, and, round trip just to get one movie. And that's if I got in there, grabbed it, and, we paid for it and got right back out. And, as a kid, I didn't really mind that, all that wait and that process. I just knew that was part of that process. But now that I've become more accustomed to things like the internet and, different things like that, it's really, it's kind of caused my patience to atrophy a little bit. Where, if my online movie takes a few seconds to load, I'm like, oh, are you serious? Why is this messing up? When I was willing to wait an hour and a half plus for a movie when I was growing up. And so I think it's important for us to be mindful of those things. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't use these modern technologies, but I think we ultimately need to remember, what's important. These, you know, modern technologies and luxuries might have benefits, but ultimately it's God that sustains us, and He gives us something better than any of this technology on earth ever could. And I think something that ties into that is we shouldn't lose sight of the ultimate, most important things we have in God. And also, shouldn't lose sight of the basic blessings that we have. There's some things for those of us in the United States and other similar countries. There are a lot of basic luxuries we probably enjoy, even if you're not wealthy, that they're not universal throughout the world. You know, it's not the case in every place in the world that you can drink tap water. Healthcare in certain parts of the world isn't as good. There are people in parts of the world, they have to walk miles to get anywhere. And, there are people that are homeless and starving, around the world. And I've had times where, I would get upset over something so trivial where, it's like, oh, so and so got more likes or shares or, whatever on social media. And I used to let that get to me way more than it should have. And it shouldn't have got to me at all. But, I eventually had this moment where I thought, I need to quit laying in my bed with a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food in my stomach, and ultimately Jesus in my heart, crying because I didn't get as many likes on social media as somebody else did. We need to have the proper perspective with these things. We shouldn't cause them to, you know, cause us to have this mindset of like where we just take so much for granted. And I think that's something that can happen. Sometimes we get so accustomed to just getting all these luxuries and being pampered by technology, and everything's just like that. It's like, give me this, give me that, right away. And times where, we maybe don't get our way or don't get something we want, again, that patience and, our sense of joy and being content has atrophied some. So again, we can use these things, but I think it's really important for us to say, while I might have the internet, while I might have the TV, while I might have, these basic luxuries around me in my home, and, I can use those for good things, ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important thing is God and my relationship with Him. And so I think that that's really what we need to keep in mind in these situations. And, I've done a whole video on social media jealousy of how I think that sometimes, we can become, we see these different things other people have. And, I think that social media can sometimes give us a distorted view of, people want to show you all the great stuff in their life and you don't see the downsides. And, we become obsessed with, I got to get this, 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 and that, to keep up with my friends and everything like that. And I think sometimes we get too much of our value from owning fancy things and, these different types of things when we shouldn't. And we should ultimately remember where we do get our value. We're told that God knew us and had a plan for us before we were even born. And Romans 5:8 tells us that Christ died for us when we were yet sinners. And we get to have eternal life and spend eternity with our perfect Heavenly Father. And nothing on this earth, I don't care how luxurious it seems, nothing can even come close to that, how amazing all of that is. And so I think when, when we feel this discontent of, when we see these things of, I have to have that fanciest sports car, I got to have the nicest cell phone around, or the biggest and most high definition TV, or these different things, or my friends are in relationships and I'm not, they're constantly posting pictures on social media and of their relationship, and it gets a lot of likes. I got to go out and get that. While those things I mentioned might not inherently be evil, we don't get our value from those things. We shouldn't get our value from those things. And I really want to pose the question of, do you really want your value? Do you want your soul to be limited to the value of a car, of a TV, of your cell phone? Is that really what you want to limit your value by? These things that might seem fancy but definitely have a limited value? Or do you want to get your value from the priceless blood of Christ and the infinite love of God? That's where I want to get my value. And so, ultimately, when it comes to, technology, we can use it in positive ways or negative ways, but we ultimately need to remember that God is our ultimate source, and that we need to check ourselves and our hearts, because we can do wrong with or without technology, but God can do great things with us, with or without technology. And so I hope that you found this video helpful, and until next time, God bless.